They thought it was just a group photo of soldiers from 1905, but when researchers zoomed in 100 years later, their discovery shocked the world. Subscribe to the channel, watch more videos, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The rain had been falling since dawn, washing the streets of the small Virginia town and drumming softly against the windows of the War Heritage Museum. Inside the quiet, half-lit building, where the scent of old paper and wax polish lingered in the air, young archivist Emily Carter carried out the kind of task that usually passed unnoticed by anyone but her. She was bent over a stack of neglected boxes, shifting them carefully across the cool stone floor of the museum's basement, hunting for materials that could be restored for a new exhibition. It was monotonous work, sorting through broken frames, tattered flags, and yellowed documents. Yet she performed it with diligence, her hands protected by cotton gloves, her mind disciplined by the love of history. For years, this museum had existed on the margins of attention. While tourists flocked to the grander institutions in Washington, D.C., few visitors came here, and those who did usually belonged to the town's older generation or to school groups dragged along by teachers. The museum was more a quiet sanctuary of memory than a bustling attraction. It kept alive the personal stories of local soldiers who had fought in conflicts stretching back to the Revolutionary War. To Emily, who had grown up hearing about her great-grandfather's service in the Spanish-American War, every artifact carried a weight that could not be measured by catalog numbers alone. She had chosen this profession because she believed forgotten history deserved another chance to breathe. That morning, after moving a particularly heavy crate filled with worn uniforms and rusted medals, Emily noticed a tall, cylindrical leather case pushed into a corner behind a cabinet. Dust clung to its surface so thickly that it seemed untouched for decades. She pulled it free with effort, coughing as a cloud of ancient powder rose into the air. The case was cracked along the seams, its straps brittle, but the brass clasp still clicked open with a surprising sharpness. Inside, carefully rolled and tied with faded string, was a photograph so large that it had to be unfurled across a wide table to reveal its entirety. At first, Emily thought she had stumbled upon a panoramic battlefield sketch, something drawn by an artist's hand. But when the roll loosened and the image spread before her eyes, her breath caught in her throat. It was no sketch. It was a photograph, an immense, painstakingly preserved image that filled nearly the entire table. Across the surface stretched an astonishing sight: more than 1,000 soldiers of the United States Army, aligned in rigid rows, their uniforms crisp, their rifles gleaming even in the faded monochrome tones of the picture. Emily bent closer, narrowing her eyes. She expected the faces to blur into one another, as they usually did in old group portraits where early cameras struggled with depth and clarity. Yet here every face was distinct. She could see the solemn expressions of the men, the lines around their eyes, the faint curls of hair that escaped beneath caps. It was as though time had conspired to trap not just a regiment, but individual souls, frozen in a clarity she would have sworn belonged to the 21st century, not the dawn of the 20th. Her hands trembled as she traced the edges of the photograph. Even the ground beneath the soldiers was astonishingly detailed. She could pick out blades of grass, small clumps of dirt, and, most shockingly of all, cigarette butts scattered at the boots of the men in the first row. The photograph captured them so sharply that she could almost smell the smoke. This was impossible. Cameras of 1905, when the caption beneath the picture claimed it had been taken, were bulky and imprecise. They relied on glass plate negatives, small in size and limited in resolution. Nothing she had ever seen in her studies or her work suggested that a camera of that era could capture detail so fine. She pressed her hand to her chest and forced herself to breathe. Doubt flickered across her mind. Could it be a reproduction? Something touched up later with modern technology? She checked the paper more closely. The fibers were coarse and fragile, consistent with early photographic stock. She sniffed and caught the faint metallic tang of old chemicals. No, this was no modern print. This was an original artifact, its age undeniable. Emily carefully rolled the photograph back into its case and hurried upstairs. The museum's director, Robert Hensley, was a man in his 60s with graying hair and a reputation for caution. He preferred the safe certainties of catalog numbers and accession records to wild claims. But when Emily spread the image across his desk, he leaned forward, his face hardening into an expression of stunned disbelief. His glasses slid down his nose as he adjusted them again and again, muttering under his breath. "This can't be real," he whispered. "Not with this clarity. Not in 1905. He pointed at the corner of the image where a soldier's medal glinted with light. Even the tiny engraving was visible. Then he motioned towards the cigarette butts, just as Emily had noticed. He shook his head slowly, overwhelmed by the contradiction. The technology, the materials, the very physics of early photography, none of it should have allowed such a thing. For several minutes they stared in silence, each lost in thought. Emily felt a strange shiver pass through her. It was as though she were not simply handling a photograph, but holding a secret, one deliberately buried and only now resurfacing. The director finally straightened his back, his voice firm, though his hands still trembled. "We'll have it examined immediately. This could change everything about our understanding of military photography." Emily nodded, though part of her feared what would happen once others laid eyes on it. She felt an inexplicable connection to the men in the picture, as though they were staring out across a century directly into her life. The next day, the photograph was carefully prepared for temporary display in one of the museum's smaller exhibition halls. Word spread quickly through town. At first, only a few curious locals trickled in, but soon the hall was filled with visitors whispering in awe. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders to point out details. Veterans from more recent wars stood silently, studying the posture of the soldiers. Some laughed softly when they noticed the casual litter of cigarettes. Others grew solemn when they saw medals pinned to uniforms, captured so clearly that even the scratches were visible. Newspapers seized on the story. By the end of the week, headlines appeared. "Impossible photograph found in Virginia Museum," and "Army of 1905 seen in high definition." The articles drew attention not only from readers, but also from academics and skeptics. Theories began to spread. Some suggested it was an elaborate hoax, others that it was the product of forgotten technology, or even a mysterious trick of light and chemistry lost to time. Emily watched all this unfold with a mixture of pride and unease. She had uncovered the artifact, and now it threatened to eclipse everything the museum had ever exhibited before. As crowds grew, she found herself drawn repeatedly back to the photograph. She lingered in front of it long after closing hours, her eyes tracing the rows of faces. It was not only the technical impossibility that fascinated her, it was the humanity of the image. Every man was frozen in that instant, his life and story sealed within the frame. On one late evening, as thunder rolled outside, Emily leaned close to the photograph and whispered softly to herself. She wondered how many of these men had gone on to fight in later wars, how many had lived to tell their grandchildren about this day. The picture was no longer just a riddle of technology. It was a bridge across time, a chorus of voices captured in silence. When she finally locked up the museum and stepped into the storm, she carried with her the heavy knowledge that the discovery was only the beginning. The impossible clarity of the soldiers' faces was not an end in itself. It was an invitation, a challenge hurled across a century. And Emily knew, deep in her heart, that the world would not rest until the truth behind this photograph was revealed. The following week, when experts began arriving to examine the artifact more closely, the quiet life of the museum was shattered forever. The museum no longer felt like the same quiet sanctuary it had been only a month before. What had once been a modest institution known mostly to local families and history teachers was now the unlikely center of a small storm. The discovery of the immense photograph had changed everything. On most days, lines of visitors stretched along the steps, umbrellas and hats dotting the scene as people waited for a chance to see what newspapers had quickly christened the impossible photograph. Inside, the staff bustled like they never had before, guiding guests through narrow corridors, answering questions, and pointing eager eyes toward the glass case where the artifact had been placed under careful lighting. For Emily, the young archivist who had unearthed the photograph, the change was dizzying. She found herself repeating the story of her discovery so many times that it no longer sounded like her own. Journalists asked her to pose in front of the glass display to describe the moment she had unfurled the great roll of paper across the dusty table. She complied, though every retelling left her strangely hollow, as though she were somehow betraying the intimacy she felt with the photograph. She remembered the thunder outside that night, when she first lingered in front of the faces of the soldiers, and the secret sense that they had been speaking directly to her across time. Now, those faces belonged to the public, and every detail was picked apart with both fascination and suspicion. The suspicion grew quickly. Experts in photographic history began to weigh in through newspaper columns and radio interviews. Some declared it an obvious fake. They insisted that a photograph from 1905 could never capture the detail of cigarette butts or engraved letters on a medal. Others argued that it might indeed be authentic, but that it represented some rare experimental process, perhaps one that had been lost to history. Still, others whispered that the museum itself had fabricated the artifact to draw attention, though those voices were more interested in scandal than scholarship. Within the museum, the first real doubts arose when the director, Robert Hensley, ordered a set of scientific examinations. Under the careful hands of specialists, the photograph was subjected to chemical analysis. Samples of the paper fibers were examined, and the emulsion was studied under microscopes. To everyone's astonishment, the results confirmed its age. The materials were entirely consistent with the photographic processes from the first decade of the 20th century. There were no traces of modern inks, no suspicious irregularities. By every measurable standard, it was authentic. And yet, the impossible clarity remained. Visitors lingered for hours in front of the display, crowding so closely that guards had to remind them not to press their hands against the glass. Many found themselves whispering, as though afraid to disturb the silence captured in the image. Some pointed out soldiers who reminded them of their own grandfathers or great-grandfathers. Others marveled at the sheer scale of it, the endless rows of men lined up in perfect symmetry, a human ocean frozen in black and white. The longer one looked, the more details emerged. A thread loose on a sleeve, a patch of mud on a boot. Even the expressions varied: pride, nervousness, boredom, defiance. It was as though the photograph had swallowed time itself and preserved it beyond reason. The press fed on these details eagerly. Headlines became bolder. Was America hiding high-definition photography in 1905? Asked one national newspaper. Impossible lens captures cigarettes before they were smoked, quipped another. Television news ran segments featuring close-ups of the photograph, digitally magnified for audiences at home. With each passing week, the mystery deepened and the skepticism sharpened. Emily, though proud of the discovery, found herself pulled in two directions. On one hand, she wanted the world to see the faces that had captivated her. On the other, she felt a gnawing unease every time she overheard accusations of forgery. She knew what she had seen in the basement, how the leather case had crumbled at her touch, how the paper had smelled of age and dust. She knew the artifact was real. Yet she had no answer for how such clarity could exist when the technology of the time should have blurred the image into indistinct smudges. The tension within the staff grew as well. Some employees grumbled that the museum was unprepared for the crowds and that the photograph was swallowing every resource they had. Others whispered their own theories. A janitor swore that he had seen a reflection in the glass that didn't belong to any of the visitors. A secretary joked darkly that the soldiers in the photograph might step out one night and march across the hall. Such talk was dismissed as nerves, but beneath the humor lay a sense that they were dealing with something beyond their comprehension. At night, after the museum closed, Emily often stayed behind to walk through the exhibition hall. The silence after the crowds had gone was profound, and the photograph loomed like a living presence in the dim light. She would stand in front of it, her own reflection faintly visible on the glass, and study the smallest corners. Once she noticed a soldier in the third row who seemed to be suppressing a smile, his eyes glinting with amusement, while all those around him stared forward grimly. Another time she realized that a young man in the back had his hand clenched tightly, as though holding something hidden from view. Each discovery made her heart race. How much more could be uncovered if only they had the tools to examine it fully? Her thoughts were echoed by the director, though he tried to maintain his composure in public. He confessed to her one evening, after the last visitor had left, that the photograph troubled him deeply. "It should not exist," he said, his voice low and weary. "Every law of optics tells us it is impossible, and yet it is here. Which means either history is wrong, or we are missing something enormous." That sense, that something enormous was missing, hung over the museum like a cloud. As weeks passed, letters began to arrive from universities and research institutions across the country. Scholars wanted access. Historians demanded copies. Photographic engineers offered to conduct detailed scans. The museum's board, initially skeptical, realized they were at the center of a growing international fascination. Arrangements were made to invite a team of experts to study the photograph in depth. By the time the decision was announced, the town itself had transformed. Restaurants and shops thrived on the influx of visitors. Hotels filled with guests who had traveled hundreds of miles just to catch a glimpse of the mysterious artifact. Emily walked the streets and overheard conversations everywhere. People debating whether it was real, whether it was a hoax, whether it meant America had possessed secret technology long before the world was ready. The photograph had become not just an object, but a legend, a story retold in every corner of the community. Still, doubt persisted, gnawing at the edges of belief. The impossibility of the details could not be reconciled with the certainties of history. For every visitor who marveled in awe, there was another who muttered that it had to be fake. And for every expert who confirmed the authenticity of the materials, there was another who scoffed that no such camera could have existed. Emily sensed that the arrival of the research team would mark a turning point. One way or another, the doubts would have to be addressed. The photograph could no longer remain a curiosity locked in a glass case. It demanded explanation, demanded truth, and it would not rest until someone uncovered it. As she left the museum late one evening, the air cool and sharp with the promise of autumn, she glanced back through the tall windows of the exhibition hall. There, faintly lit by the night lamps, the rows of soldiers seemed almost alive, their eyes fixed on a horizon that no one else could see. She shivered, knowing that the next chapter of this mystery was about to unfold, and that once the experts arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. By the time the leaves had turned crimson and gold across the rolling hills of Virginia, the museum no longer resembled the modest place it had been. The impossible photograph had transformed it into a destination, a pilgrimage site for the curious and the skeptical alike. Each day, the lines outside grew longer, and each night the museum echoed with the exhaustion of a staff that had been stretched far beyond its normal rhythm. The artifact's fame had outgrown the small town that sheltered it. Scholars, journalists, and tourists poured in as though the building itself contained the key to rewriting history, and in a sense, perhaps it did. Emily Carter felt both exhilarated and wary as she moved among the visitors, answering questions, guiding them toward the display, and repeating once again the story of her discovery. It was no longer just her story. It belonged to the world now. She could not have imagined that a dusty leather case in the basement would lead to this, yet here she was, living in the middle of a storm that showed no sign of calming. When she looked at the photograph late at night, after the museum had closed and silence had fallen once more, she felt a new kind of weight pressing upon her. It was no longer just the uncanny clarity of the image that unsettled her. It was the sense of expectation. The world wanted answers, and soon experts would arrive to provide them. The announcement that a team of international researchers had been invited electrified the town. Hotels filled even before the scholars arrived, and news crews set up equipment on sidewalks in anticipation of interviews. Local merchants put up signs celebrating the photograph, while schoolchildren were given assignments to write essays about it. The photograph had become more than a mystery. It had become part of the town's identity. Emily could not step outside without overhearing speculation, from barbershops to grocery stores, about what the experts might find. When the day finally came, the air itself seemed charged with expectation. A convoy of cars pulled up to the museum, carrying men and women whose names Emily recognized from articles and academic journals. There was Dr. Richard Whitman, a renowned historian of early American military technology, his reputation for skepticism preceding him. Beside him walked Dr. Claire Morrison, a photographic engineer from MIT, known for her work on restoring century-old negatives. And there was the imposing figure of Professor Heinrich Kruger from Berlin, whose lectures on optical instruments had been translated worldwide. They were joined by several others, each carrying cases of instruments and laptops, their eyes already sharp with curiosity as they approached the entrance. The museum staff, dressed with unusual formality, welcomed them inside. Reporters jostled for photographs, and the flash of cameras filled the lobby. Emily watched the procession from the side, her heart pounding. These were the people who would test the photograph's secrets, who might either vindicate her discovery or reduce it to a trick of chemistry. She longed to speak to them to tell them how she had found the artifact, but she remained silent, waiting until the inevitable moment when they would be gathered around the display. That moment came quickly. Within half an hour, the researchers stood in the exhibition hall, their cases laid open on tables, their instruments gleaming under the lights. The glass case containing the photograph was carefully unlocked, and the artifact was transferred to a secure surface for examination. Visitors were kept at a distance, though they craned their necks and whispered among themselves, eager to glimpse the drama unfolding. Emily stood near the back, watching as the experts leaned over the enormous image, their expressions shifting from curiosity to astonishment. It was Dr. Morrison who first broke the silence. She adjusted her magnifying lenses and shook her head slowly. "This level of resolution is impossible for 1905, she murmured, her voice carrying across the room. "Not improbable. Impossible." Others leaned closer, peering through their instruments. They measured, scanned, and whispered to one another. One researcher traced the lines of a soldier's boot, another examined the faint glint of a medal, while another studied the blurred smoke rising from a cigarette. Everywhere they looked, impossibility stared back at them. Professor Kruger, his brow furrowed deeply, called for higher magnification. Digital scanners were set up, and slowly, sections of the photograph appeared on large screens for everyone to see. The room fell silent as the details emerged. Buttons with tiny engravings, threads fraying from cuffs, beads of sweat shining faintly on a soldier's temple. The image was so clear that some visitors gasped as though they were looking at a living face rather than a century-old artifact. Emily felt her chest tighten. The clarity she had once experienced alone in the quiet of the basement was now magnified 100 times over and shared with the world. She remembered the soldier she had seen suppressing a smile, the hidden clenched hand, and wondered what else might be waiting to be discovered. It was then that Dr. Whitman, ever the skeptic, pointed toward the background. "There," he said, his voice firm. "Do you see it?" The others followed his gaze. At first, it seemed to be nothing more than scaffolding or equipment set up for the occasion, but as the scanners enhanced the image, the shapes grew more distinct. Behind the regiment, partially obscured by canvas and shadow, stood a massive structure on a platform. It resembled a camera, yet far larger than any known from the period, with a lens that appeared as wide as a dinner plate, mounted within a framework of gears and supports. A murmur rippled through the room. Cameras of 1905 were large, yes, but nothing like this. Nothing so advanced. The implications were staggering. Professor Kruger removed his glasses and rubbed his temples. "If that is a camera," he said quietly, "then it was decades ahead of its time. Decades." Dr. Morrison, though visibly shaken, began running through possibilities. Could it have been an experimental prototype built for some military purpose? Was it possible that such a device had been constructed and then lost, its existence erased from records? She looked around at her colleagues, and though no one spoke, the silence was filled with the weight of recognition. They all knew they were staring at evidence of something history had never acknowledged. The director of the museum, pale but composed, cleared his throat. "We invited you here for clarity. It seems the photograph has only deepened the mystery." The examinations continued for hours. As the researchers moved through the photograph, inch by inch, more peculiarities emerged. Light fell across the soldiers in a way that suggested a precision of lens beyond anything documented. The absence of distortion across such a vast field was unprecedented, and always there loomed that colossal device in the background, half hidden but undeniable. When evening came, the researchers gathered in the director's office, their notes spread across the table. Emily sat quietly in the corner, allowed to remain because she had been the one to find the photograph. The debate grew heated. Some argued for the authenticity of an unknown technological marvel. Others urged caution, unwilling to rewrite history without irrefutable proof. But none could deny the evidence of their own eyes. At last, Dr. Morrison spoke with finality. Whatever this is, it does not belong in 1905. Either we have misunderstood the limits of the era, or this artifact reveals a chapter of history we never knew existed. Emily listened, her heart pounding. The photograph had moved beyond mystery into revelation. She could feel the air thick with anticipation, as though the soldiers in the image were watching from across a century, waiting for their secret to be uncovered. And as the researchers prepared for further study, planning to return the next morning with more sophisticated equipment, Emily knew that the doubts of the past weeks had given way to something far greater. The impossible photograph was no longer just a curiosity. It was a riddle powerful enough to challenge history itself, and its answers lay waiting in the silent, staring faces of over 1,000 men captured by a lens that should never have existed. The following morning dawned gray and unsettled, as though the sky itself mirrored the tension that had settled over the museum. A chill wind rustled the trees outside while the researchers gathered once more around the long tables, their notes spread wide, their voices low but urgent. The discovery of the strange machine in the background of the photograph had changed everything. The doubts and arguments of the day before seemed almost trivial compared to the implications that now pressed upon them. If that structure truly was a camera, then history as they knew it was incomplete, perhaps even deliberately obscured. Emily watched them from the edges of the room, the weight of her discovery pressing more heavily upon her with each passing hour. She had never sought the spotlight, never expected that an afternoon spent clearing out dusty storage would thrust her into the center of an academic storm. Yet now she felt as though she stood at the threshold of something vast, something both exhilarating and frightening. She could not shake the sense that the photograph had been waiting all these years to be found, and that by unrolling it on that table she had released more than just an image into the world. The researchers, divided by training but united by curiosity, agreed on one essential point. They needed context. The photograph could not be understood in isolation. If such a machine had truly existed, there would be traces of it somewhere, even if only faint ones. A project of that size could not have left no record at all, and so they turned to the archives. Letters were written to the National Archives in Washington, to university libraries, and to military repositories. Teams were dispatched to dig through old newspapers, journals, and dusty files. Some of the scholars who had arrived in Virginia now found themselves boarding trains and planes, pursuing faint threads of information in far-flung collections. Emily volunteered to assist with the local searches. She spent long hours in dim reading rooms, her hands trembling as she sifted through brittle papers and yellowed clippings. Most of what she found was mundane. Lists of supplies, rosters of men, official reports about training exercises, yet buried among them were peculiar references, subtle hints that suggested something larger had been underway in those years. One report from 1904 mentioned optical experiments conducted under military supervision, though no details were given. Another described the construction of temporary wooden platforms at a training ground in Virginia, structures large enough to support heavy equipment. Late one night, as she sat bent over a stack of documents, she stumbled across an obscure journal from 1906. Its language was vague, but a single passage caught her breath. It spoke of field trials of long-range optical devices for purposes of reconnaissance. There was no photograph, no diagram, only the dry words of a military clerk. But to Emily, it felt like a spark. She copied the reference carefully and carried it back to the museum. When she showed the researchers, the room filled with low murmurs. Professor Kruger tapped the table thoughtfully, nodding in recognition. "It matches," he said. "The size of the lens, the scaffolding. It must have been a prototype, perhaps never completed, perhaps abandoned. But it was real." Dr. Whitman, ever cautious, frowned. A vague line in a journal is not proof. It could refer to binoculars, to telescopes, to any number of things. We cannot leap to conclusions. Dr. Morrison countered quickly. And yet, the photograph itself is proof. The image exists, and it shows us what words will not. Even if the records are vague, the artifact speaks clearly. We are not imagining those details. The debate raged for hours, and Emily sat quietly, absorbing every word. She sensed that they were circling around something that none of them dared to state plainly, that the photograph might not merely be a commemorative portrait, but rather the public face of a hidden experiment. What better cover for testing a massive, experimental camera than a regiment lined up for a grand portrait? No one would question the presence of equipment. No one would suspect that the true subject was not the soldiers themselves, but the power of the lens that captured them. The more they considered this possibility, the more plausible it seemed. A military eager to expand its influence at the dawn of the 20th century would certainly have sought new methods of reconnaissance. Balloons had been used in wars for observation, but they lacked precision. A camera capable of capturing vast detail from a distance would have been invaluable. Perhaps, the scholars mused, the photograph represented one such experiment, a glimpse of a secret program now long forgotten. Further searches brought more fragments. A letter discovered in a private collection mentioned the monstrous camera cart that had startled local farmers near a training ground. A newspaper clipping, barely legible, described unusual photographic activities during Army maneuvers in 1905. None of these alone was definitive, but together they painted a picture that grew harder to dismiss. Piece by piece, the impossible began to take shape as reality. For Emily, the human element remained most compelling. As she listened to the scholars argue over lenses and emulsion, she returned again and again to the faces in the photograph. If these men had stood for hours before an experimental device, what had they thought of it? Did they whisper jokes about the strange machine? Did they understand that they were part of something secret, something that would vanish from history almost as soon as it was recorded? She imagined the conversations they must have had, the mixture of pride and frustration, the boredom of standing motionless while a gigantic contraption loomed behind them. One evening, long after the researchers had retired to their hotels, Emily lingered in front of the image once more. The hall was empty, and the only sound was the faint hum of the lights. She stared at the corner where the strange device stood, half shrouded in shadow. For the first time, she noticed what appeared to be a figure beside it, a man in a dark uniform, his features blurred but his posture attentive, as though he were guarding the machine. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass, and felt a thrill run through her. She had seen hundreds of photographs from the early 1900s, but never one that hinted so strongly at something deliberately hidden. The next day, she showed the others, and once again the room erupted with excitement. They enhanced the image digitally, drawing out details invisible to the naked eye. The man was indeed there, his cap set at a sharp angle, his hands resting on the framework of the device. His presence confirmed what many had begun to suspect. This was not a random arrangement of scaffolding, but a carefully constructed experiment. The discovery intensified their search. Requests were sent to military historians, to private collectors, to families known to have preserved letters from ancestors who had served. Slowly, painfully, the traces accumulated. The scholars could not yet declare with certainty what the machine had been or why it had vanished, but the outlines of a hidden story had begun to emerge. Emily felt herself caught in the tide of it, swept along by forces larger than her own life. Each new fragment pulled her deeper, each new discovery binding her more tightly to the photograph and its mystery. She sensed that they were on the verge of uncovering something monumental, something that would shake not only the history of photography, but the history of the nation itself. And though she feared what they might find, she also longed for it, with a hunger she could not deny. That night, as the town settled into uneasy slumber and the researchers prepared their next forays into the archives, Emily stood once more before the great photograph. The soldiers stared out at her, silent and immovable, yet filled with stories waiting to be told. And behind them, that shadowed machine seemed to whisper across time, daring her and the others to seek its truth. The doubts that had once filled the museum were gone. In their place had grown a new conviction, fragile but undeniable, that the impossible photograph was not merely an accident of history. It was a window into a secret world, a hidden project buried beneath layers of silence and time. And though the traces were faint, they were there, waiting to be followed, leading inexorably toward revelations no one had expected to find. As the weeks turned into months, the photograph no longer belonged only to the scholars or to the museum that housed it. Word of the discovery spread across the country and seeped into distant towns and cities, carried by newspapers, radio broadcasts, and whispered conversations at family dinners. People who had never before given thought to century-old military regiments suddenly found themselves wondering if their own ancestors might be among the faces that had been captured with such impossible clarity. What had begun as an academic puzzle was quickly transforming into something deeper, more personal. It became not just a question of technology, but of memory, of family, of the enduring human desire to connect with the past. Emily Carter noticed the change almost immediately. At first, the letters that arrived at the museum were largely from historians and photographers, full of technical questions and speculation. But soon, a different kind of correspondence began to pile up. Handwritten envelopes appeared, some on fragile paper that seemed almost as old as the photograph itself, others in careful cursive or shaky handwriting that spoke of age. They came from across the country, from New England farmhouses, from bustling cities in the Midwest, from distant California towns, and nearly all of them carried the same hope. The writers believed they recognized a face among the rows of soldiers. They wanted to know if their grandfather, their great-uncle, their ancestor long buried in family stories might truly be there. The museum was soon overwhelmed. People arrived in person, carrying yellowed photographs, diaries, and keepsakes, begging for the chance to compare them against the magnified scans of the impossible photograph. Some came with reverence, others with skepticism, but all carried the unmistakable weight of longing. The hall that had once been filled with silence now rang with voices, with stories being told and retold, with laughter and tears mixing as generations reached across a century to find one another. Emily became the natural bridge between the researchers and the families. Her patience and warmth made her the one visitors turned to, and she found herself spending long hours listening to tales that often meandered between memory and myth. An elderly man from Ohio arrived one afternoon with a letter written by his grandfather, a soldier who had served in 1905. The paper was fragile, but the words were clear. In it, the young man had described a monstrous camera cart with an eye larger than a dinner plate, and the long hours the regiment had been forced to stand still while the photographer adjusted it. Emily guided him to the magnified section of the photograph where, with trembling hands, he pointed to a face that bore his family's unmistakable jawline. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered, "That's him." Not long after, a family from Pennsylvania arrived carrying an heirloom pocket watch. It had been passed down through 4 generations, and inside the lid was an inscription with a date that matched the day the photograph was supposedly taken. When the researchers enlarged one section of the image, there it was, the same watch, clutched in the hand of a young soldier standing proudly in the front row. The family gasped as though seeing their ancestor alive again, the photograph confirming what until then had been only a family legend. Each story added another layer to the mystery. An elderly woman named Margaret traveled from Kansas with faded photographs of her grandfather, who had always told her about the day the Army made us statues for some machine. She stood before the impossible photograph for nearly an hour before pointing with a shaking finger. "There," she said, her voice breaking. "He always told us about the medal he received that day." And sure enough, the medal was visible, freshly pinned, shining faintly in the monochrome image. It was not even recorded in official military documents until months later, but the photograph bore witness to its presence. The researchers, who had been so consumed with lenses and emulsion, found themselves listening as intently as Emily. They began to realize that the photograph's significance was not only technological, it was human. Each soldier in the image had lived, breathed, and carried stories that were now echoing through the voices of their descendants. The impossible photograph was no longer just a riddle of science. It was a tapestry of lives stitched together across time. For Emily, this was the most powerful transformation of all. She had always been fascinated by the details, the cigarette butts, the threads, the impossible clarity. But now, hearing these families speak, she understood that the true miracle lay not just in the sharpness of the lens, but in the bridge it created between generations. She watched children staring wide-eyed at the faces of men who might have been their great-great-grandfathers. She listened to veterans of modern wars stand silently before the image, whispering words of respect. She saw laughter when a family recognized the mischievous grin of a young man, and she saw tears when another realized they were gazing upon someone they had only ever known through fading stories. The scholars did not stop their work. They continued to scan, to analyze, to search for archival traces of the machine that had captured the impossible. But even they began to soften, to spend time listening to the families, to admit that their investigations had taken on a new dimension. Professor Kruger, who had once been so stern, was moved nearly to silence when he stood beside a boy pointing proudly to his ancestor in the photograph. Dr. Morrison, the most analytical among them, found herself gently explaining details of the photograph to families who had never before cared about emulsion or glass plates. The photograph had changed them too. One evening, after a long day of visitors, Emily lingered in the quiet hall once again. The photograph loomed before her, its faces illuminated softly by the museum lights. She thought of the Ohio farmer's letter, of the pocket watch, of Margaret's trembling finger. Each detail had transformed the artifact from an enigma into a living archive. She realized that what had begun as a technical impossibility had become something greater, something no one could have foreseen. It had become a chorus of voices rising from the past, carried forward by the descendants who refused to let them be forgotten. And yet, as moving as these stories were, they also deepened the mystery. The letters, the medals, the watches, all confirmed that the photograph was genuine, that it captured not just an image, but a moment of history. But why had it been taken in such a way? Why the monstrous machine, the secrecy, the absence of records? The families could recall the pride of their ancestors, but even in their stories there were shadows, hints of orders not to speak, of projects hidden from public view. Emily left the hall that night with her heart both full and restless. She could feel that they were drawing closer to something extraordinary, something that lay beyond the personal stories and family heirlooms. The soldiers in the photograph had left their voices in letters and medals, but the machine behind them still whispered its secret across time. The past was speaking more loudly now, and the museum, once so quiet, had become a place of living memory. But Emily sensed that the greatest revelations were yet to come, and that the photograph had not yet given up its deepest truths. The museum had grown used to the daily influx of families, each bringing their own stories and heirlooms, but beneath the warmth of those encounters a darker current had begun to stir. The researchers, still pursuing their analysis, had started to uncover threads that hinted not only at forgotten technology but at deliberate silence. It was one thing for records to be lost over time, quite another for them to be erased. And the more they searched, the clearer it became that erasure, not accident, explained the gaps surrounding the impossible photograph. Emily had seen it in their faces first. The excitement that had once filled the scholars, the exhilaration of discovery, had dimmed and given way to something more cautious, even wary. They still welcomed the families, still marveled at the stories that surfaced from the past, but behind closed doors their conversations grew hushed, their brows furrowed. Whenever they met in the director's office or huddled around a table in the reading room, the air was heavy with the knowledge that they were trespassing into territory history had not intended them to see. It began with a discovery in Washington. A graduate assistant combing through the National Archives sent word that she had found a reference to large-scale optical trials conducted by the Army in 1905. The document itself was frustratingly vague, nothing more than a summary line in an inventory. But when she requested the full file, she was told it no longer existed. Whole boxes of records from that period, once catalogued, had vanished without explanation. She relayed this to the team in Virginia, and the news spread among them like a chill wind. Soon after, another researcher in Boston uncovered a letter written by a junior officer in 1906. In it, the officer described the glaring secrecy that surrounded certain experiments and his frustration at being forbidden even to discuss them with his peers. The letter ended abruptly, as though cut short. When the researcher attempted to trace the officer's career, he found it ended in silence. No further records of him appeared after that year. These fragments unsettled everyone. The scholars had begun their work expecting a mystery of technology, perhaps an undiscovered invention or a forgotten prototype. Now they faced the possibility of something more troubling, a project that had been intentionally hidden, its traces scattered, its participants silenced. Emily listened as they argued over these revelations. Dr. Whitman insisted on caution, his voice stern as he warned against weaving conspiracies from scattered evidence. "Records are lost all the time," he said. "Fires, neglect, bureaucratic incompetence, any number of reasons." But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Professor Kruger countered him sharply, pointing to the consistency of the erasures, the way documents vanished exactly where they should have shed light. "This is not negligence," he declared. "This is intent." The families, blissfully unaware of these darker suspicions, continued to bring their stories, and Emily took comfort in those human connections. But at night, when the halls emptied and the photograph glowed under its protective lights, she could not help but feel the weight of what they were uncovering. She would stand before the image, staring at the blurred figure near the massive machine, and wonder what orders had been whispered to him, what secrets he had carried to his grave. The faces of the soldiers still filled her with warmth, but now they also stirred unease. Had they known they were a part of something forbidden, something destined to be erased from memory? The breakthrough came unexpectedly, through a half-forgotten journal in a university archive. It was a bound volume of military engineering reports, covering everything from bridge construction to advances in field telegraphy. Buried near the back was a single entry dated early 1906. It spoke of experimental optical devices of unprecedented scale, designed for reconnaissance purposes, and noted that further trials are suspended pending directives from higher authority. The entry ended with a coded reference number, but when the researchers attempted to track it, they found nothing. The trail vanished into empty shelves and closed files. Emily was there when the discovery was shared with the rest of the team. The room fell silent, each person absorbing the implications. The impossible photograph, they realized, had not been an accident, nor merely a commemorative portrait. It had been a cover, a way to disguise the testing of a revolutionary machine. And if the trials had been suspended, as the report suggested, then someone at the highest levels had decided the project was too dangerous, too costly, or too threatening to continue. The questions multiplied. Why would the Army, on the eve of modern conflicts, abandon a technology that could have changed the nature of warfare? Why erase every record of it, burying even the names of those involved? Theories ranged from the practical to the sinister. Some suggested the device had been too fragile or expensive for field use. Others whispered of political battles, of rivalries within the military establishment that had crushed the project before it could flourish. And a few, their voices low and troubled, hinted at darker possibilities, that the machine had revealed something unexpected, something that frightened even those who had created it. For Emily, the speculation mattered less than the human toll. She thought of the families who had come with their heirlooms, the pride they felt in seeing their ancestors. None of them knew that their loved ones might have been caught in the web of secrecy, their service bound to a project that history had chosen to erase. She wondered what those men had been told, how they had reconciled the strangeness of standing before that monstrous machine. Did they believe they were a part of progress, or did they sense even then that they were part of something that would never be acknowledged? As winter settled over Virginia, the mood in the museum darkened. The crowds still came, their voices still filled with awe and wonder, but within the closed rooms where the scholars worked, the atmosphere grew heavy. The excitement of discovery had given way to unease. They were not simply studying a photograph anymore. They were brushing against the edges of a secret deliberately concealed. The photograph had opened a door into a chapter of history that someone had once gone to great lengths to seal shut. One evening, as Emily prepared to leave, she paused again in front of the photograph. She let her eyes travel across the rows of soldiers, across the medals and boots and weary faces, until they reached the shadowed corner where the machine loomed. The figure beside it seemed clearer now, as though her repeated gazes had brought him into focus. He stood stiffly, his expression unreadable, his presence both ordinary and ominous. She felt a chill run through her, as if the man were watching her as much as she watched him. She turned away reluctantly, knowing that the coming weeks would bring even greater revelations. The photograph had already united families and ignited debate, but its deepest truths still waited in the shadows, and Emily sensed, with growing certainty, that the next discovery would not only change how they understood the past, it might also force them to confront why that past had been buried in the first place. The cold days of winter passed, but the shadow of secrecy uncovered by the researchers lingered in the air of the museum. Families still arrived with their heirlooms, tourists still lined up along the steps, and journalists continued to send their reports across the country. But now there was a different kind of weight behind the photograph. It was no longer only an enigma of technology or a bridge for descendants to meet their ancestors. It had become a symbol of questions that had no simple answers, of knowledge that had been hidden and then revealed by accident more than a century later. The impossible photograph was not merely a discovery, it was a reckoning. Emily Carter felt the transformation most of all. She had been the one to unearth the artifact, to carry it into the light. But now she often wondered whether the photograph had chosen its own time to be seen again. It had survived neglect, dust, and obscurity, waiting until the world was ready to confront its mystery. And when the time had come, she had been the hands that delivered it. Every morning as she unlocked the museum doors, she felt that sense of destiny pressing more firmly upon her. The museum itself had changed beyond recognition. What had once been a quiet, nearly forgotten institution now pulsed with life. An entire new wing had been planned and constructed in record time, funded by donations that poured in from across the nation. The heart of this wing was a hall built solely for the impossible photograph. There it hung in climate-controlled glass surrounded by screens that displayed magnified sections, accompanied by plaques recounting the soldiers' stories gathered from their descendants. Visitors entered in reverent silence, as though stepping into a shrine. Children pointed in awe. Grandparents whispered names they had thought lost, and veterans stood stiffly at attention, saluting men long dead. International attention had grown as well. Scholars from Europe, Asia, and beyond traveled to Virginia to see the artifact for themselves. Academic journals filled with articles debating its origin, its technology, its implications. Some hailed it as the most important photographic discovery of the century, while others cautioned against overstating what could not yet be proven. But no matter the stance, no one could deny the fascination it inspired. The photograph had become more than an image. It was a question, posed to the entire world, asking what else history had hidden. For the families, the impact was even more profound. More than 200 descendants had been identified with certainty in the photograph, their ancestors' faces now known in perfect detail. For many of them, it was the first time they had seen those men as more than names in family Bibles or faded lines in records. Some families held reunions in the museum hall, gathering cousins who had not spoken in decades, brought together by the shared pride of recognizing their heritage. The photograph had united bloodlines as surely as it had confounded scholars. Yet, even as these personal stories blossomed, the darker undertone remained. The researchers could not ignore the deliberate silences in the archives, the vanished files, the abrupt endings of careers. Each new attempt to trace the fate of the massive camera hinted at obstacles carefully placed. Rumors began to circulate in academic circles that the machine itself might still exist, stored away in some forgotten military warehouse, hidden among the relics of wars long past. A grainy photograph surfaced, showing what might have been the giant lens mounted on a platform, but its origin was uncertain, its authenticity unprovable. The idea that such a thing could still lie waiting in the shadows gripped imaginations everywhere. Emily often pondered that possibility late at night when the museum was empty and she stood alone before the display. She would stare into the corner where the shadowed machine loomed, her eyes tracing the blurred figure of the man who had guarded it, and she would feel the weight of all the unanswered questions. Why had the project been buried? Why had the men been ordered to silence? Why had history chosen to erase something so extraordinary? The answers never came, but the photograph itself seemed to whisper that they were out there, waiting to be found by those who dared to look long enough. The scholars, weary but undeterred, pressed forward. They reconstructed the lives of many of the officers captured in the image, tracing careers that stretched through the First World War, through distant assignments, through medals won and battles lost. Some had risen to prominence, others had disappeared into anonymity, but together they formed a living chain of history that the photograph had frozen in its impossible clarity. Each name added to the list was another thread woven back into the tapestry of memory. As the new wing of the museum opened officially, dignitaries arrived from across the country. Speeches were given, cameras flashed, and the impossible photograph was unveiled once more, now the centerpiece of a hall designed to last for generations. When Emily was invited to speak, she stood nervously before the crowd, her voice soft but steady. She did not speak of technology or secrecy. Instead, she spoke of connection, of how the photograph had allowed children to see the faces of men who had once marched in the sun of 1905. She spoke of families reunited, of letters brought forth from attics, of medals recognized for the first time. This photograph, she said, is not only a riddle. It is a bridge through time, a way for us to touch the past and let it speak to us again. The audience rose in applause, and for a moment Emily felt the presence of those silent soldiers around her, standing once more in their endless rows, their eyes fixed on some horizon that no one else could see. She knew then that the photograph's true power lay not only in its mystery, but in its humanity. It had preserved more than faces. It had preserved pride, sacrifice, and memory itself. Still, the unanswered questions could not be ignored. The scholars left Virginia with more work ahead, determined to track every lead, to sift through every archive, to seek the truth of the machine that had defied time. Some believed they were chasing a ghost, others believed they were on the cusp of rewriting history, but all agreed that the search could not end here. The photograph had forced open a door, and once open, it could not be closed again. As spring returned to the town and the lines outside the museum grew once more, Emily walked the quiet hall in the early mornings before the doors opened to the public. She would pause before the glass, her reflection mingling with the soldiers, and she would whisper silently to them. She told them that their stories were safe now, that they had not been forgotten, that generations yet unborn would look into their eyes and know who they were. And in those moments, though she knew she was only a custodian of paper and emulsion, She felt as though the past had reached forward to hold her hand. The impossible photograph remained what it had always been. A paradox, a marvel, a challenge to the certainties of history. But it had also become something more. It was a living monument, binding the present to the past, binding families to ancestors, binding truth to mystery. Its greatest secrets still lingered in the shadows, perhaps in a warehouse, perhaps in erased files, perhaps forever lost. Yet its greatest gift was already revealed. It had reminded the world that history is never truly silent, that voices, once thought forgotten, can rise again if only someone is willing to look closely enough. And so the museum stood, forever transformed, its quiet halls now alive with the footsteps of thousands. And in its heart, beneath the soft glow of lights and the watchful gaze of visitors, the soldiers of 1905 stood eternal, captured by a lens that should never have existed, waiting patiently for the day when the rest of their story would finally be told. If this story amazed you, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Watch our other videos for even more unbelievable discoveries, and share this one with your friends so they can see it too.